And we're back with Bobby Herrera. Bobby is the co-founder of Populist Group. So we were talking about a little bit about the culture of your company, and you gave us 3 good points of, why you exist. And I want to summarize those again, and because I think they're really important. And I think it's a question all companies should be asking themselves and reviewing it from time to time. So the first one was why you exist, and then how you behave and what you do, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And you describe that quite well. And so it just is very important. Culture is very important nowadays with a lot of companies. And so can you tell us a little bit of how you went about implementing that culture? It's kind of cool that you call your employees climbers. I like that. I know that years ago Walmart would call them associates. And so so how do you do that internally? I mean, when do you call them climbers, or hi climber, or how does that look like on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. So that the origin and the essence of it I already shared, right? I wanted anyone that ever joined our community to know what it meant to be a part of Populist Group. And it wasn't always that way, though. As I mentioned, the first 5 years, most fun I never want to have again. Well, the second 5 years, Carmen, I call it the holy bleep era.
Holy bleep.
Yes, insert whatever your favorite bleep is. We had some great return on luck from those first 5 years. We put in a lot of hard work. And in those second 5 years, we experienced some very fortunate growth.
Wow.
Well, if you recall, I started this journey with 2 other gentlemen, and they're great friends of mine to this day. However, we weren't the right fit for one another to start business together. That's a big decision. So after that chapter ended and it was just myself, although that was a very painful yet amicable event, I was now the sole owner of the culture. So basically, I now had full control and autonomy of what I wanted to build. So I'll take you back to a story when I first started the company. My wife and I were living in California, and we were going to move to Detroit to start this journey. And before we left California, we had shipped our stuff out. Neither one of us had ever lived in Detroit. Well, this was a big step for us. We'd been married 6 months, and we were going for broke. Well, having little exposure to what this entrepreneurial journey was going to look like, we decided to take a road trip when we made the move. And when we left California, we took the 2-day journey to drive to Detroit. And we had talked about all the potential scenarios around this next step for us. Well, on the way, we talked about even more. And Ross and I are different. She's a planner, I'm a cowboy. I'm an organizational nightmare. And she wants to know the details of how we're gonna do it and how we were gonna be successful.
What's gonna happen
You
next?
got it. I'm pretty comfortable with just roaming and letting things happen. Well, we were about 100 miles from Detroit, and she asked me a very simple question. She said, honey, is this gonna work out? And I could tell that she was scared. And I was like, I really believe in my heart that it is. And then she asked me the easiest question that she's ever asked me. She said, are you scared? And I said, I'm terrified. But I knew that I wanted to build something that would allow me to pay forward what I'd experienced that night on the bus. And so I had this raging inside of me. And for the remaining balance of that trip, I explained to her that I want to build a community that feels like they're part of something bigger than themselves, where people are worthy to be themselves, where people always tell the truth, no matter what the circumstances are. where we always have each other's back, where we don't take ourselves too seriously and we act like kids who have a lot to learn, where we remain humble, and where we learn from the best. And so I started explaining to her, in a sense, how I wanted my company to feel. And then she says, how are you going to do that? I'm like, I have no idea. I'll find a way.
Heavenly culture.
Yeah.
Goodness.
Well, the reason I explain that to you is I imagined with great detail what I wanted the company that I wanted to build to feel like. Except for those first 5 years, I was so focused on survival that culture took a back seat. And all these things that I wanted to bring to life, I didn't know how. But the biggest mistake that I made was I never communicated with the people that I was bringing in what I communicated with my wife. I never shared what I imagined. Nobody knew that but me. I didn't even tell the bus story to the people that were working with me until like year 9. So I made 2 real big mistakes. One, I didn't share with the people that were giving me time away from their family to help me the force that drove me. So one, I didn't tell that story. And 2, I never shared with them what I imagined. And you can't build something without telling your story and without sharing what you imagine. Carmen, once I did, they helped me and we built it together. And that became our culture code. What I described to Rosalind on that road trip eventually became our culture code, our boundary, our code in which we were going to build this community together.
That's wonderful. You know, and you just shared 2 points. One of the questions we asked towards the end of the show is what kind of mistakes you made, and so you've already shared that, and those are really good lessons to hear. You know, you mentioned you were terrified because there was some, sounds like, financial struggles, and a lot of businesses go through that, particularly when you're starting off or, you know, things happen in the economy. And so how did you overcome, you know, your circumstances in terms of, you know, the financial arena?
Well, any business, regardless of what problem you're trying to solve for the world, money's going to be tight. And it took us a while to get out of that. You know, that's part of being an entrepreneur. You have to, you know, be very creative. You have to go off the beaten path. You know, it took at least 5-6 years to finally get to a point where we felt like we could keep reinvesting and actually even make money. You're not going to make money for a while, and you need to prepare yourself for that.
Right, and also too, the reason I asked, because I was looking at your timeline. You started the business in 2002, and then you talked about the first 5 years, and then the second 5 years, and then, you know, we had that economic struggle back in 2009 and 2010, and the big national banks weren't loaning any money at all to small businesses, I know. And so I think there was a time when a lot of small business had to fold up because of that. So that typically the financial arena is a major kind of event, and not only event, but it does require lots of planning ahead of time, you know, if you're going to make it. But yeah, so but you stayed on with it, and you know, you the folks that you were involved with embraced your vision. So you shared that vision, and it looks like, you know, they embraced it, and so let's fast forward to, I mean, you've got a lot of things going on, because I know you're an active speaker, and you've been a keynote speaker at several business events that I went to. So how did you start doing that? Because I think that led to writing your book, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, my dad was a storyteller, and he was a great storyteller.
Oh,
And
wow.
I didn't realize growing up the gift that he was sharing with me. And my dad had a way of telling stories, and he'd always tell me a story, and then he'd tell me the lesson, and he'd ask me a question, about the story and the lesson that I just shared that would make my hamster wheel spin and make me think about it. And then he would, in his own way, he was a bit of like the Mexican Paul Harvey. You remember Paul Harvey, the rest of the story, We're dating ourselves a little bit there, but after that, he would say, and son, the best part of that story? And he would tell me about something that happened after. And I just organically learned how to tell stories from rarely leaving my dad's side. And, I think it's interesting in business, we have this like facade that you can't communicate that way. And we've all sat through these boring presentations and these mind-numbing conferences that we've all gone to, right? And the person starts speaking and you're drifting. Why? Because they're not telling the story. And it took me a while to realize when I started my company how powerful storytelling was, because I bought into that dogma that, okay, I have to do it this way. But once I figured that out, I believe storytelling is arguably one of the most critical competencies, if not the most critical competency of leadership. Because when you think about it, right, story, your role as a leader, your role as an entrepreneur is to narrate that story. And so you have to have exceptional clarity with it. You have to be able to do it in a manner that keeps people engaged.
Yeah, I agree, and your stories are so wonderful. So you started doing these speaking engagements at different venues, and then I'm sure you did them at your company probably first. And then how did that lead into the book?
Well,
the name of the book is The Gift of Struggle, right?
Right.
And I love the title. So.
Thank you. Well, the Climbers at Populous Group, they're in a sense like my kids. Like they were probably the best training for my journey into parenthood. They've heard these stories so many times that when I tell them, they just roll their eyes. They're like, yeah, I know, Bobby, I know. And so absolutely, I tell those stories over and over and over within Populous Group. But to answer your question directly, I actually got into like the speaking by going to speak to kids and paying forward that act of generosity from Mr. Teague. And we do a lot, and I do a lot for kids born on the wrong side of the opportunity divide, like myself, and keeping my part of that promise,
right?
That from that gift Mr. Teague gave me. And I also do a lot of speaking for veterans, and that's at the core of where my storytelling started. And I'll tell stories to kids, I'll tell stories to veterans, ultimately to help them take control of their own story. And the more I did that, I started getting, more invites to come speak or to come tell the same stories. I tell the same stories at a CEO talk that I do when I go speak to a group of 8th graders from Seattle.
So you started telling the stories at the schools?
Sure, just schools and just organizations that support veterans. I'm on the board of a wonderful organization named Bunker Labs that helps veteran entrepreneurs build a better network and do what you and I have tried to do as entrepreneurs, Carmen, take control of our own story. So there's so much need out there in the world right now, but you have to pick a lane, and the lanes that I've picked are helping kids that were like me and helping veterans.
That's awesome. I think we'll do our last break for today, and we'll be right back.